Have you spoken to the president today yet, sir?
No, I didn't speak to the president today.
What do you? Any reaction to the news that you put out?
No, look, we'll continue to conduct these complex negotiations in the best interest of Canadians. It's a negotiation. Ça va continuer.
Will you back down from the DST?
Anita Anand is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she joins me now. Minister Anand, good to see you again. Thank you for being here on the show today.
Thanks for having me, David.
We're going to talk about NATO and the trip to Europe in just a second, but I have to ask you about these latest developments between Canada and the United States, with Donald Trump saying he's ending all trade talks because he's unhappy with the digital services tax, which is coming into force next week. What do you make of this move? How is the federal government going to respond?
Well, our position remains that we will continue to act in the best interests of Canadians. We will be pushing and seeking at all turns to ensure that these unjustified tariffs are removed. And in particular, I will say that we won't be negotiating in public given the complexity of the negotiations, given the need to ensure that Canada's position is the strongest possible it can be.
We're about 12 days, I think, at this point into the 30-day timeline. And if the president is true to his word here that talks have ended, I mean, what is your immediate sense of the ability to keep moving ahead, to try to accomplish anything within the 30 days? The steel sector was here yesterday, worried about the job losses just rising at an exponential rate if this keeps going. Just what are your thoughts there on the ability to even keep moving forward right now?
Well, I'd first like to shout out the steel and aluminum industries in our country that are suffering under 50% unjustified tariffs. And we will continue to advocate and act in the best interests of all Canadian businesses, including the steel and aluminum industry. I will also say that supply management has been an important cornerstone of our economic policy, and that too is extremely important for industry, and in particular the agriculture and the agri-food industry. So these are cornerstones of our negotiations. We have certain guiding principles. We're going to continue to push in the best interests of Canadians and Canadian businesses, and we will ensure that the best result is reached for our country. At the same time, we are ensuring that we diversify our supply chain so that we are never again 80% dependent on one particular economy. That's why we have signed the Defense and Security Partnership with the European Union. I signed that on Monday with Minister McGuinty. That's why we are pursuing the diversification strategy in terms of our trade relationships. That means finding new partners abroad. That means deepening our relationships with existing allies. You know, David, we say that we are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. That's true, but we need to leverage those trade relationships now more than ever, and that's exactly what we're doing with CETA and beyond.
Yeah, well, I take your point and your reference there to supply management, because Donald Trump did take aim at dairy products and tariffs there in his social media post today. But it is the trading relationship with the biggest G7 country economically that is in breach right now because of all of this. And Donald Trump says he's ending the trade talks because of the digital services tax, which he calls an egregious tax. This is a new policy for this government, for this country, so it's not a cornerstone policy like supply management. Is it something the government of Canada is willing to reconsider if that's what it takes to move ahead on a trade agreement with Donald Trump?
Again, Minister LeBlanc has carriage of this file and will be taking this and all other issues forward in the negotiations that will not be occurring in public. I will say that on the digital services tax, there are other jurisdictions that are currently utilizing this form of a policy. Let's look at Italy, let's look at the UK, let's look at France. And so let's let also Minister LeBlanc do the work that he needs to do on behalf of our country and make sure, as I said, at all times that Canada comes out on top.
Okay, Minister, I do want to ask you as well about the European agreement that you announced and the commitments that were made at NATO this week. And just to catch the audience up here, this week the Prime Minister signed on to his biggest spending commitment yet. Canada is now on the hook to spend 5% of its GDP on defense by 2035, which is the new agreed upon NATO spending target. The Prime Minister says it will cost Canada about $150 billion a year, and most of that will go directly to military spending on things such as equipment and personnel, but more than a fifth of that money can go to infrastructure, things such as airports or roads to mineral projects and ports and other telecommunications and other expenditures like that. So, Minister, a big commitment this week with Europe, in addition to trying to expand the partnership and the trading relationships you outlined. But defense is now going to become the biggest line item, spending item in the Canadian budget. And the Prime Minister suggested it may force a conversation about some things the federal government can no longer do, at least towards the end of the decade. Do you think Canadians will sign on to that if it means losing out on other areas?
Well, David, let's take a step back and talk about the important moment in Canada's committing to the 2% of GDP target that Canadians have repeatedly asked us to do. And our government under Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to be doing it this year. And so we are standing up as a founding member of NATO and a multilateral partner with all other countries to ensure that we're at 2%. And we are also committing to 5% in the long term. That's by 2035 with a review period in 2029. So let's make sure we have all of those facts on the table.
Sure.
Now let's down that 5%. The 5% is, after we get to 2% this year, leaves 3%, obviously. 1.5% is going to be on investments in critical defense and security related expenditures, airports and ports, emergency preparedness systems. Those are infrastructure projects that will benefit the Canadian economy overall, David. So there is a dual purpose, dual use out of that expenditure. And then 1.5 additional percentage points are going to be spent, first and foremost, I will add, on core military expenditures, supports for the Canadian Armed Forces, and ensuring that they have the military equipment that they need. We know that the Canadian Armed Forces is an institution that does need further supports, whether we're talking about salaries and other supports like housing, or whether we're talking about key pieces of infrastructure and equipment. And the good news is that our government is taking those requirements on board immediately.
No, and Minister, I get the breakdown and I understand the value of that money in those specific sectors, but I was struck by what the Prime Minister said, that towards the later part of this decade and into the early part of the next decade, if the spending does keep growing like this, like $150 billion, because we're using current dollars, not 2035 dollars, that's a third of all government spending right now. And the Prime Minister made the point that it will likely force a conversation about some things like the federal government can no longer do if you have to keep meeting these spending levels based on the threat environment of the day. And I just wonder what it is you think at this point might be squeezed out by the need to meet these NATO commitments.
So let's be clear. When you're dealing with federal money, which is taxpayer dollars, there is always that calibration of how we prioritize domestic economic and personal needs, if you will, whether we're talking about families or seniors or students or children. Those are all groups that our government has committed to, whether it's the Canada Child Benefit or the $10 a day childcare or increases in OAS and GIS that our government has committed to. But in the long term, of course, we're going to have to calibrate the needs of Canadians and weigh those needs against expenditures generally, whether it is on defense expenditures or other expenditures overall. And that's a matter of dealing with scarce resources. Governments must do that responsibly. And so, what the Prime Minister is saying in the first instance, reaching 2% is a responsible decision. Making sure that we are collectively acting with our allies as we move towards 5% is also responsible. And finally, making sure that we do that reevaluation in 2029 and recalibrate where the priorities must lie for Canadians in terms of where they are at right now. What are the needs of Canadians? That's a conversation, of course, that will be had, and we will make sure it is done responsibly.
Well, Minister, as you well know, committing to a spending target, planning for a spending target, are not executing a spending target. And you've been Minister of Defence, you've done procurement and Treasury Board, so you're well aware of the challenges that have existed, right, in terms of getting procurement money out the door in particular. So how realistic is it that you can get this done in the time frame that's available? Like, let's look at the 2029 horizon, for example, of being reasonably on the way there. And I mean, what tripwires have to be overcome inside the system as it exists right now? Because I know you want to build a domestic industrial capacity for this, but that's likely going to take a bit of time before it's ready to work. So how quickly can you move on this?
Well, David, these are my favorite questions, so thanks for asking them. I will say, first and foremost, we have an agency that we are setting up to ensure that procurements can move faster. Second of all, we need to ensure that our domestic industrial base is activated, and that will be the case, for example, with the EU Strategic Partnership Agreement that we just signed last Monday, so that domestic companies are going to be able to compete on par with European companies in terms of procurements overseas. And then thirdly, I will say that there are procurements in line to be executed as we speak, whether we're talking about the River-class destroyers, whether we're talking about the F-35s, whether we're talking about ensuring that those polar icebreakers are built and functional. These are all fundamental procurements that are underway, and we will make sure that the Canadian Armed Forces are well supported in terms of their salaries and wages, but also in terms of the equipment that they are utilizing to defend and protect our country.
Okay, Minister, I've gone over time, but I'm hoping you can indulge me with one more question on just one more topic, because it's been that kind of news week. But you put out a statement earlier this week that your officials were seeking information on the death of a Canadian 49-year-old Johnny Noviello who died in ICE custody in Florida. Now, I know Mr. Noviello had not lived in Canada for quite some time, but he did have Canadian citizenship and was in U.S. custody. What's the latest you can tell us on the circumstances surrounding his death? What information have your officials gleaned?
So the individual was a permanent resident of the United States since approximately 1991. When we heard that he had been detained, our consular officials reached out and were in touch with him. At this point, we are also seeking additional information relating to the circumstances of his passing away. And I'd like to extend my condolences to his family. But at all times, regardless of who as a Canadian citizen is detained, our consular officials are there reaching out, making sure that the individual is treated fairly. So we are in the process of seeking additional information at this point, but because of privacy concerns, I won't be in a position to continue to share those additional details.
Okay, so details like official cause of death, things like this, you don't have those, you can't release those. We'd have to get those from American authorities, or what's your understanding of where things are? I know there were underlying health issues potentially at play here, but are you limited on what you can say about that?
I am limited, but as I said, from a foreign affairs standpoint, our role is to ensure immediately that our consular officials are reaching out to Canadians abroad and providing supports and ensuring that they are treated fairly to the best of our ability. That's exactly what our officials were doing from a consular perspective. And as I said, we are in touch seeking additional information relating to this particular case.
Okay, Minister, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. That's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anita Anand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Take good care.